The words hung in the air between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. Yet there they were, standing at opposite ends, hearts pounding with the electricity of truth finally spoken. Timothy Rivera's hands trembled as he reached up to cup Frank Murphy's face, his thumbs brushing across cheekbones that had become as familiar as his own reflection, and whispered the words that would change everything between them forever. I've been in love with you for 2 years and 4 months, and I can't pretend anymore that this friendship is enough for me. Frank's world tilted on its axis as those words sank in, recontextualizing every stolen glance, every lingering touch, every moment of inexplicable tension that had accumulated between them like storm clouds gathering on a summer horizon. The confession hit him like a physical force, and he found himself gripping Timothy's wrists, not to pull away, but to anchor himself in this moment that felt both inevitable and impossible. Timothy, Frank breathed, his voice barely audible above the hum of the refrigerator in his kitchen. I thought I was going crazy. I thought I was imagining things, making connections that weren't really there. You weren't imagining anything, Timothy replied, his voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill down his cheeks. Every time you looked at me like you wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Every time we sat too close on the couch and you didn't move away. Every time you made excuses to spend time with me instead of going home to Lisa. You weren't imagining any of it, Frank. The space between them seemed to shrink without either of them moving, and Frank felt his carefully constructed walls crumbling with each word that fell from Timothy's lips. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments because this story is about to take you on an emotional journey that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about love and friendship and the courage it takes to reach for what your heart truly wants. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, standing in Frank's kitchen at 11:37 at night with the weight of unspoken truth finally released into the world like a bird freed from its cage, we need to go back to the beginning. To the day when Timothy first realized that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered universe. 3 months earlier, Timothy had been sitting in his favorite coffee shop, the one with the mismatched furniture and the barista who always drew hearts in the foam when Frank walked in looking like he'd been hit by a truck and then dragged behind it for several miles. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled in ways that suggested he'd slept in it, and there was a hollow look in his eyes that made Timothy's chest tighten with concern and something deeper that he wasn't ready to name. Frank spotted him immediately across the crowded cafe and made his way over, weaving between tables with the careful precision of someone who was barely holding himself together. He collapsed into the chair across from Timothy with a heavy sigh that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Lisa and I broke up, he announced without preamble, running his hands through his hair in a gesture that Timothy had come to recognize as Frank's tell when he was overwhelmed and trying to maintain control. She ended it last night, said she couldn't do it anymore. Timothy felt his heart skip a beat and immediately hated himself for the tiny spark of hope that ignited in his chest like a match struck in darkness. I'm sorry, he said, and meant it, even as part of him wanted to celebrate the news. What happened? Do you want to talk about it? Frank laughed bitterly, the sound cutting through the ambient noise of the coffee shop like a knife through silk. She said I was emotionally unavailable, said I acted like I was somewhere else even when I was right there with her, like my body was present but my mind and heart were miles away. Said it felt like I was saving all my real emotions for someone else. The words hung between them, loaded with meaning that neither of them was ready to acknowledge, heavy with implications that made Timothy's pulse quicken and his palms grow damp with nervous sweat. Timothy felt his breath catch in his throat as he studied Frank's face, searching for any sign that his friend understood the weight of what Lisa had said. Was she right? Timothy asked carefully, his fingers playing with the handle of his coffee cup in a nervous gesture that he couldn't seem to control. Frank was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond Timothy's shoulder, his brown eyes distant and troubled. I don't know, he finally admitted, his voice soft and uncertain. Maybe. I kept thinking about how different I felt with her versus how I felt with other people. With you, specifically. The confession was small, almost throwaway, but it hit Timothy like a lightning bolt, sending electricity shooting through his veins and making his heart race with possibility. He felt his breath catch in his throat, as Frank's eyes met his across the small table. And for a moment, the entire coffee shop seemed to fade away until there was nothing but the two of them and the electric tension crackling between them like a live wire. "What do you mean?" Timothy managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter this fragile moment of honesty. Frank shook his head as if trying to clear away cobwebs that had been accumulating for months. "I don't know how to explain it. I just know that when I'm with you, I feel like myself. Like I don't have to perform or pretend or be anyone other than who I am deep down. And with Lisa, even though I cared about her, it always felt like I was playing a role, reading lines from a script someone else had written." Timothy's heart was beating so hard he was sure Frank could hear it across the table, the sound of it thundering in his ears like a drum. The rational part of his mind told him to be careful, to not read too much into what could be simple friendship appreciation. But the part of him that had been harboring feelings for Frank for over 2 years was practically vibrating with possibility and hope. "That sounds like it was hard," Timothy said, choosing his words carefully like he was walking through a minefield. "To feel like you couldn't be yourself with someone you were supposed to love." Frank nodded, his fingers absently tracing patterns on the wooden table between them, creating invisible designs that only he could see. "The thing is, I don't think I even realized it was happening until she pointed it out. She said I lit up differently when I talked about my friends, about you specifically, than I ever did when I talked about our future together. She said it was like I was performing happiness with her, but genuinely experiencing it with you." The words settled between them like a challenge, and Timothy felt his carefully maintained composure beginning to crack like ice under pressure. He had spent 2 years and 4 months perfecting the art of being Frank's friend, of listening to his relationship problems and offering advice while his own heart broke a little more each time. He had become an expert at hiding his feelings, at pretending that the way Frank made him feel was normal, platonic, safe. But sitting there in that coffee shop, with Frank looking at him with an expression that was equal parts confusion and something that might have been longing, Timothy felt his resolve beginning to crumble, like a wall that had been weathered by too many storms. "Maybe she was seeing something you weren't ready to see yet," Timothy said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them, before his rational mind could intervene and remind him of all the reasons this was dangerous territory. Frank's eyes sharpened, focusing on Timothy with an intensity that made his skin feel too tight and his breath come too fast. "What do you think she was seeing?" he asked, his voice low and careful. Timothy felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff, and Frank was asking him to jump without knowing if there was water below or jagged rocks. The safe answer would be to deflect, to make some generic comment about self-discovery and emotional growth. But something in Frank's expression, a vulnerability that Timothy had rarely seen, made him want to be brave for once in his life. "I think she was seeing that you're happiest when you're being authentic," Timothy said carefully, his words measured and deliberate. "And maybe authenticity for you looks different than what you thought it would. Maybe what makes you happy isn't what you expected." They sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging between them like a storm about to break. Timothy watched as Frank processed his words, saw the moment when understanding began to dawn in his eyes, followed quickly by something that looked like panic mixed with recognition. "I should go," Frank said suddenly, standing so quickly that his chair scraped against the floor with a harsh sound that made other customers look over. "I need to think about things, process all of this." Timothy nodded, trying to hide his disappointment behind an understanding smile. "Of course. Take all the time you need. I'm here whenever you want to talk." But as Frank turned to leave, he paused and looked back, his hand on the back of his chair. "Timothy," he said, his voice soft and uncertain. "Yeah," Timothy replied, hope blooming in his chest like a flower reaching towards sunlight. "Thank you for always listening, for always being there when I need someone to talk to, for being the kind of friend who lets me figure things out without judgment." "Always," Timothy replied, the word carrying more weight than Frank could possibly know, and watched as Frank walked away, his heart pounding with the weight of everything they hadn't said. The days that followed were a study in careful avoidance that left Timothy feeling like he was walking on eggshells made of his own hopes and fears. Frank, who usually texted Timothy at least 3 times a day about everything from work frustrations to funny memes he'd seen online, went completely silent. Timothy found himself checking his phone obsessively, crafting and deleting messages, trying to strike the impossible balance between giving Frank space to think and maintaining the friendship that had become the cornerstone of his emotional world. It was Eugene Hall who finally intervened, cornering Timothy in the office break room like a concerned intervention specialist. Timothy's coworker and closest friend after Frank had been watching him mope around the office for a week, growing increasingly worried as Timothy's usual cheerful demeanor gave way to distracted anxiety and barely concealed heartbreak. "Okay, what's going on?" Eugene demanded, blocking Timothy's path to the coffee machine with the determination of someone who had reached his limit of watching a friend suffer in silence. "You look like someone stole your puppy and then kicked you while you were down, and you've been checking your phone every 30 seconds for days." Timothy sighed, slumping against the counter with the defeated posture of someone who had been carrying a heavy burden for too long. "Frank and I had a conversation last week, and now he's avoiding me completely." Radio silence for 6 days and counting. Eugene raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting from concern to curiosity. "What kind of conversation are we talking about here? The kind where you discuss the weather, or the kind where feelings were involved? The kind where I maybe sort of implied that his ex-girlfriend was right about him being emotionally unavailable to her because he's actually in love with someone else," Timothy said in a rush, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. Eugene's eyes widened, and Timothy could see the exact moment when understanding dawned on his friend's face. "Please tell me you're not talking about yourself when you say someone else." Timothy's silence was answer enough, speaking volumes in the space between them. "Oh, honey," Eugene said, his voice gentle and filled with the kind of compassion that comes from watching a friend navigate impossible territory. "How long have you been in love with him? And don't try to deny it because it's written all over your face." "2 years and 4 months, Timothy admitted, the words feeling strange on his tongue after keeping them locked away for so long, like a secret that had grown too heavy to carry alone. "And you've never said anything to him about how you feel," Eugene said, though it was more statement than question. "What was I supposed to say?" Timothy asked, his voice breaking slightly with the weight of 2 years of suppressed longing. "He was with Lisa for most of that time. He's never shown any interest in men, as far as I know. I convinced myself that being his friend was enough, that having him in my life in any capacity was better than risking everything by telling him the truth." Eugene studied him for a long moment, his expression thoughtful and knowing. "But it's not enough, is it? Being just his friend." Timothy shook his head, feeling tears prick at the corners of his eyes like tiny needles. "No, it's not. And now I've probably ruined everything by pushing him to examine his feelings when he wasn't ready. I may have lost the best friendship I've ever had because I couldn't keep my mouth shut. Or," Eugene said thoughtfully, leaning against the counter beside Timothy, "maybe you've given him permission to examine feelings he was already having, but was too scared to acknowledge. Maybe you've opened a door that needed to be opened." Before Timothy could respond, his phone buzzed with a text from Frank, the sound making his heart leap into his throat like a startled bird. "Can we talk? My place tonight at 8. There are things I need to say." Timothy's hands shook as he showed Eugene the message, hope and terror warring in his chest. "Well," Eugene said with a smile that was equal parts encouraging and nervous, "I guess you're about to find out which one of us is right about this situation." Timothy spent the rest of the day alternating between excitement and terror, his emotions swinging like a pendulum between hope and dread. He changed clothes 3 times, practiced conversations in his car during lunch break, and arrived at Frank's apartment building at exactly 8 o'clock, with sweaty palms and a racing heart that felt like it might beat right out of his chest. Frank answered the door, looking as nervous as Timothy felt, his usually perfect hair mussed and his eyes brightened with anxiety and something that might have been anticipation. "Hey," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. "Come in, please." Timothy followed him into the familiar living room, noting the 2 glasses of wine already poured on the coffee table, sitting there like peace offerings. Frank had always been thoughtful like that, anticipating needs before they were expressed, taking care of the people he loved in small, meaningful ways. They sat on opposite ends of the couch, the space between them feeling both vast and charged with electricity that made the air itself seem to hum with possibility. Frank picked up his wine glass and took a long sip before speaking, his movements careful and deliberate. "I've been thinking about what you said," Frank began, his voice careful and measured like he was walking through a verbal minefield. "About authenticity and being happiest when I'm being myself. About what Lisa saw that I couldn't see." Timothy nodded, not trusting himself to speak, afraid that any words might shatter this fragile moment of honesty. "The thing is," Frank continued, his fingers tracing the rim of his wine glass in a nervous gesture, "I don't think I've ever really been myself with anyone before this week. Not completely. I've always felt like I was performing, trying to be what other people expected me to be instead of figuring out who I actually am." "What do you think people expect you to be?" Timothy asked gently, his voice barely above a whisper. Frank laughed, but there was no humor in it, only a bitter recognition of years spent living up to expectations that had never felt quite right. "Straight, successful, the kind of guy who dates beautiful women and talks about sports and never questions whether the life he's building is actually the life he wants. The kind of man who follows the script that society wrote for him without ever asking if it's the story he wants to tell." Timothy felt his breath catch in his throat, hope blooming in his chest like a flower reaching towards sunlight. "And is it the life you want?" Frank met his eyes then, and Timothy saw a vulnerability there that made his chest tighten with love and fear and possibility all tangled together. "I don't know," Frank admitted, his voice soft and uncertain. "I thought it was. I convinced myself it was because it was easier than questioning everything I thought I knew about myself. But lately, especially this week, I've been wondering if I've been lying to myself about what makes me happy." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of Frank's words settling between them like a bridge that neither of them was sure they were ready to cross. Timothy could feel his heart pounding as he tried to figure out how to respond, how to be supportive without pushing too hard, how to encourage honesty without demanding more than Frank was ready to give. "What makes you happy?" Timothy asked finally, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own heartbeat. Frank's smile was soft and genuine for the first time in days, transforming his entire face and making Timothy's heart skip several beats. "You do," he said simply, the words falling between them like stones dropped into still water. "Spending time with you makes me happier than anything else in my life. And that scares the hell out of me because I don't know what it means." Timothy felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving him gasping for breath in a space that suddenly felt too small and too large all at once. He set his wine glass down with shaking hands, afraid he might drop it and shatter the fragile moment they had created. "Frank," he whispered, his voice carrying 2 years and 4 months of suppressed longing. "I know it's complicated," Frank said quickly, as if he was afraid Timothy might bolt for the door before he could finish explaining. "I know I'm probably not making any sense, and I know this changes things between us in ways that might be scary. But I can't stop thinking about what Lisa said, about how I was saving my real emotions for someone else. And I keep coming back to you, Timothy. Every time I try to imagine being truly happy, you're there." Timothy's mind was reeling, caught between the dream he'd been nurturing for over 2 years and the reality of Frank sitting across from him, finally saying the words that Timothy had imagined in 1,000 different scenarios, but never quite believed would actually happen. "What are you saying?" Timothy asked, his voice barely audible above the thundering of his own heartbeat. Frank moved closer on the couch, close enough that Timothy could smell his cologne, could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could count the freckles that dotted his nose from their recent weekend at the beach. "I'm saying that I think I've been in denial about something important for a very long time," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm saying that when I imagine my future, when I imagine being truly happy and authentic and whole, you're always there, not as my friend, but as something more." Timothy felt tears prick at his eyes, hope and fear warring in his chest like opposing armies. "As your friend," he repeated, needing to hear Frank clarify what he meant. Frank reached out then, his fingers brushing against Timothy's hand in a touch that sent electricity shooting up Timothy's arm and straight to his heart. "I don't think so," he said softly, his voice filled with wonder and uncertainty, and something that sounded like the beginning of love. "I think it's something more." something that I've been too scared to name or acknowledge or even let myself feel. The touch sent shockwaves through Timothy's entire nervous system, and he found himself leaning into it despite every rational thought telling him to be careful, to protect his heart, to not get his hopes up too high. Frank, I need you to be sure about what you're saying, he said, his voice shaking with the effort of maintaining control. Because I can't go back to pretending after this. If you're not sure if this is just confusion or curiosity or processing your breakup, I need to know now. Frank's hand found his properly then, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that felt both natural and revolutionary, like something they had been meant to do all along but had never been brave enough to try. I'm not sure about anything, Frank admitted, his honesty cutting through Timothy's fear like sunlight through clouds. But I'm sure about how I feel when I'm with you. I'm sure that every relationship I've ever had has felt like settling, like accepting something good enough instead of waiting for something extraordinary. I'm sure that you're the first person I've ever wanted to tell everything to, the first person who's ever made me feel like I could be completely myself without fear of judgment. Timothy's heart was beating so hard he was sure it was visible through his shirt, his pulse thundering in his ears like a drum that drowned out every rational thought. And I'm sure that I've been in love with you for 2 years and 4 months, he said, the words tumbling out in a rush of honesty that felt both terrifying and liberating. I'm sure that every time you dated someone else, it felt like a knife turning in my chest. I'm sure that I've been pretending to be okay with friendship when what I really wanted was to kiss you every time you smiled at me, every time you laughed at something I said, every time you looked at me like I was the most important person in the room. Frank's eyes went wide, and for a moment, Timothy was terrified that he had said too much, moved too fast, pushed Frank away with the intensity of his feelings. But then Frank was moving closer, his free hand coming up to cup Timothy's face with a gentleness that made Timothy's breath catch in his throat. 2 years and 4 months, Frank repeated, his voice full of wonder and something that might have been regret. You've been feeling this way for 2 years and 4 months, and you never said anything? You never gave me any sign? You were with Lisa, Timothy said, leaning into Frank's touch like a flower turning toward the sun. And before that, there was Jessica. You seemed happy with them, or at least content, and I convinced myself that being your friend was better than not having you in my life at all. I told myself that loving you quietly was enough, that I could be satisfied with whatever pieces of yourself you were willing to share. Frank's thumb brushed across Timothy's cheekbone, and Timothy felt his eyes flutter closed at the gentle contact, at the tenderness in the touch that spoke of feelings too deep for words. I'm so sorry, Frank whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I'm so sorry you had to carry that alone for so long. I'm sorry I was too blind and too scared to see what was right in front of me. Timothy opened his eyes to find Frank looking at him with an expression of such tenderness and regret and something that looked like love that it took his breath away completely. It's okay, he said softly, meaning it for the first time in 2 years and 4 months. It was worth it. You were worth it. All of it was worth it if it led us to this moment. Frank's gaze dropped to Timothy's lips then, and Timothy felt the world narrow to this moment, this couch, this man who was looking at him like he was something precious and fragile and desired all at once. Can I? Frank started, then stopped, his voice catching on the weight of what he was about to ask. Can you what? Timothy prompted gently, his own voice barely above a whisper. Can I kiss you? Frank asked, his voice barely audible but carrying the weight of a question that could change everything between them. I've been thinking about it all week, and I can't stop wondering what it would feel like, what you would taste like, what it would be like to finally stop pretending that I don't want to. Timothy's heart felt like it might burst from his chest. 2 years and 4 months of longing crystallizing into this single moment of possibility. Yes, he breathed, the word carrying every hope and dream he'd ever harbored. Please, Frank, please kiss me. Frank leaned in slowly, giving Timothy every opportunity to change his mind, to pull away, and to stop this before it changed everything between them in ways that could never be undone. But Timothy didn't want to stop it. He had been dreaming about this moment for 2 years and 4 months, imagining it in 1,000 different scenarios. And now that it was here, He felt like he might die if it didn't happen. Their lips met softly at first, a gentle brush that sent shockwaves through Timothy's entire body, making every nerve ending sing with electricity. Frank tasted like wine and possibility, and something indefinably him, and Timothy found himself leaning in, deepening the kiss as Frank's hand tightened in his hair, pulling him closer with a desperation that spoke of months or maybe years of suppressed wanting. The kiss was everything Timothy had imagined, and nothing like he had expected all at once. It was soft and desperate and perfect, full of 2 years of unspoken longing and the promise of everything they could be together. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Timothy felt like the world had shifted on its axis, like everything he thought he knew about his life had been rearranged in the space of a single kiss. "Oh," Frank breathed, his forehead resting against Timothy's, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "Oh, wow." That was... Timothy couldn't form words, couldn't do anything but stare at Frank's face, at the wonder and confusion and something that looked like relief written across his features like a map of everything he was feeling. "That felt," Frank started, then stopped, shaking his head as if words were inadequate to describe what had just happened between them. "I've never felt anything like that, Timothy. Not with Lisa, not with Jessica, not with anyone. It was like coming home and falling off a cliff all at the same time." Timothy's heart clenched with love and hope and terror, all tangled together in a knot that he wasn't sure he would ever be able to untangle. "What does that mean?" he asked carefully, afraid to assume too much but unable to stop himself from hoping. "For us, I mean, what does this mean for us?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, his thumb still tracing patterns on Timothy's cheek, his touch gentle and reverent, like Timothy was something precious that might break if handled too roughly. "I don't know," he admitted, his honesty both refreshing and terrifying. "I don't know what any of this means for my life or my future or how I see myself, but I know I don't want to pretend it didn't happen. I know I want to figure it out, whatever it takes." Timothy nodded, trying to manage his expectations even as his heart soared with the possibility of everything he had ever wanted, finally being within reach. "We can figure it out together," he said softly, his voice steady despite the way his hands were shaking. "We don't have to have all the answers right now. We can take it slow, see how it feels, give you time to process everything that's changing." Frank smiled then, the first genuine smile Timothy had seen from him in weeks, the expression transforming his entire face and making Timothy fall in love with him all over again. "Together," he repeated, like he was testing how the word felt on his tongue. "I like the sound of that, Timothy. I like the idea of not having to figure this out alone." They spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking, about feelings and fears in the future in ways they had never been able to before. Frank admitted that he had been questioning his sexuality for months, maybe longer, but had been too scared to examine those feelings too closely, too afraid of what he might discover about himself. Timothy talked about the loneliness of loving someone who couldn't love him back, about the way he had convinced himself that friendship was enough even when it was slowly killing him from the inside out. As the night wore on, they found themselves gravitating toward each other on the couch, shoulders touching, hands occasionally brushing as they gestured, their bodies seeking contact even as their minds processed the magnitude of what was happening between them. The physical contact felt natural and electric all at once, and Timothy found himself marveling at how right this felt, how much like coming home after a long journey through unfamiliar territory. When Timothy finally left at nearly 2 in the morning, Frank walked him to the door, their hands intertwined like it was the most natural thing in the world, like they had been holding hands for years instead of hours. "I'll call you tomorrow," Frank said, his voice soft in the quiet hallway, full of promises and uncertainty and hope. "I'll be waiting," Timothy replied, and meant it more than he had ever meant anything in his life. Frank leaned in then, pressing a soft kiss to Timothy's lips that tasted like promises and new beginnings, and the courage to reach for what your heart truly wants. "Good night, Timothy," he whispered against Timothy's lips. "Good night, Frank," Timothy replied, his voice thick with emotion and possibility. Timothy drove home with his heart full and his mind racing, replaying every moment of the evening like a movie he never wanted to end, memorizing every word and touch and expression. For the first time in 2 years and 4 months, he felt like he could breathe freely, like the weight he had been carrying was finally lifting from his shoulders. The next few weeks were a careful dance of discovery, with Frank and Timothy spending hours talking about everything and nothing, exploring this new dynamic between them with the caution of people who knew they had something precious and fragile to protect. They went on what could generously be called dates, though neither of them used that word at first, too afraid of the implications and too uncertain of what they were building together. Coffee shop conversations that stretched for hours, with Frank asking questions about Timothy's childhood and dreams and fears that he had never thought to ask before. Walks through the park where their hands would brush and eventually intertwine, the contact becoming more natural and necessary with each passing day. Dinners at Frank's apartment where they would sit closer and closer on the couch until they were practically in each other's laps, talking and laughing and stealing kisses that tasted like wine and possibility. The first time Frank stayed overnight at Timothy's apartment, nothing happened beyond cuddling on the couch while watching a movie, but it felt monumental anyway, like a milestone in their careful progression towards something deeper and more meaningful. Timothy woke up to find Frank's arm around him, his face peaceful in sleep, and felt his heart clench with so much love he thought it might kill him. Frank stirred as Timothy tried to extract himself to make coffee, his eyes opening slowly and focusing on Timothy's face with a soft smile that made Timothy's breath catch in his throat. "Morning," Frank murmured, his voice rough with sleep and infinitely dear to Timothy's ears. "Morning," Timothy replied, pressing a kiss to Frank's forehead that felt both natural and revolutionary. "Coffee? I was going to make that French press blend you like." Frank nodded, stretching like a cat before sitting up, his hair mussed and his shirt wrinkled from sleep. Timothy couldn't help but stare at the way the morning light caught in Frank's hair, the way his shirt had ridden up slightly to reveal a strip of skin that Timothy wanted to touch, but didn't quite dare, still uncertain of the boundaries in this new territory they were exploring. They moved around Timothy's kitchen in comfortable synchronization, Frank finding mugs while Timothy started the coffee, their movements choreographed by weeks of growing intimacy and the kind of domestic harmony that Timothy had dreamed of, but never quite believed he would experience. It felt natural and right and terrifying all at once. "This is nice," Frank said softly, accepting the mug Timothy handed him, their fingers brushing in the exchange and sending familiar sparks of electricity up Timothy's arm. "Yeah," Timothy agreed, his voice soft with wonder and contentment. "It really is." They stood there in Timothy's kitchen, drinking coffee and stealing glances at each other, and Timothy felt like he was living in a dream he never wanted to wake up from, a reality that was better than anything he had ever dared to imagine for himself. It was Eugene who finally forced them to confront the reality of their situation, cornering Timothy at work 3 weeks after that first kiss with the determination of a friend who had watched enough careful dancing around the truth. His expression was serious and concerned as he blocked Timothy's path to the copy machine. "Okay, I need to ask," Eugene said without preamble, his voice low enough that their coworkers couldn't overhear. "What exactly is happening with you and Frank? Because you've been walking around here like you're floating on air for 3 weeks, but I haven't heard you use the word boyfriend once." Timothy felt his cheeks heat with embarrassment and uncertainty. "What do you mean?" he asked, though he knew exactly what Eugene was getting at. "I mean, you've been walking around here like you're floating on air for 3 weeks, but you still haven't used the word boyfriend once," Eugene said, his tone gentle but insistent. "Are you two actually together, or are you just in some kind of romantic limbo that's going to drive you both crazy?" Timothy sighed, slumping against the wall with the weight of his uncertainty. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice small and uncertain. "We spend every free moment together. We kiss. We talk about everything. We sleep in the same bed sometimes. But we haven't actually defined what this is. We haven't put labels on it or talked about what we want from each other long term." Eugene raised an eyebrow, his expression a mixture of concern and exasperation. "And why not? What are you both so afraid of?" "Because I'm terrified," Timothy said honestly, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. "Because what if I push for more and he decides this is all too complicated and he wants to go back to the way things were? What if I ask for too much too soon and I lose him completely? What if he's just experimenting and I'm reading more into this than he actually feels?" Eugene's expression softened with understanding and compassion. Honey, he said gently, you can't live in limbo forever. At some point, you're going to have to be brave enough to ask for what you want, to have the conversation that defines what you're building together. Otherwise, you'll both just be stuck in this uncertain space that serves no one. That evening, Timothy found himself standing outside Frank's apartment, Eugene's words echoing in his head like a mantra he couldn't shake. He had been putting off this conversation for weeks, content to exist in the bubble they had created, but he knew Eugene was right. They couldn't keep dancing around the reality of their situation forever. Frank answered the door with a smile that faltered slightly when he saw Timothy's expression, concern immediately creasing his features. Hey, everything okay? You look like you have something serious on your mind. Can we talk? Timothy asked, his heart already racing with anticipation and fear. There's something I need to say, something we need to discuss. Of course, Frank said, stepping aside to let him in, his voice gentle and welcoming despite the worry in his eyes. You're scaring me a little, though. Is everything all right between us? They settled on the couch, and Timothy took a deep breath before speaking, trying to find the courage to ask for what he wanted. I need to know what this is, he said simply, his voice steady despite the way his heart was pounding. What we are to each other. Frank's expression grew serious, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Timothy, he said carefully, I know we said we'd figure it out together, and I don't want to pressure you, Timothy continued, the words tumbling out in a rush. But I can't keep existing in this space where I don't know if you're my boyfriend or my friend who I sometimes kiss. I need to know where I stand, what I can expect, what we're building together. Frank was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching Timothy's face like he was trying to read his thoughts. You want me to be your boyfriend? He said finally, and it wasn't quite a question, but wasn't quite a statement either. Yes, Timothy said, his voice steady despite the way his heart was pounding against his ribs. I want you to be my boyfriend. I want to introduce you to people as the person I'm dating. I want to hold your hand in public without wondering if I'm overstepping. I want to know that this thing between us is real and permanent and not something you're going to change your mind about when it gets complicated or when people start asking questions. Frank reached for Timothy's hands then, intertwining their fingers in the gesture that had become second nature to them both, his touch warm and steady and reassuring. I'm scared, he admitted, his voice soft and vulnerable in the quiet of his living room. I'm scared because I've never felt this way about anyone before, man or woman. I'm scared because this changes everything about how I see myself and my future and what I thought I wanted from life. I'm scared because I love you so much it terrifies me. And I don't know how to be in love with a man when I've spent my whole life thinking I was straight. Timothy felt his breath catch in his throat, hope and love and understanding flooding through him all at once. You love me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Frank nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears, and something that looked like relief at finally saying the words out loud. I love you, Timothy. I've been in love with you for weeks now, maybe months, maybe longer than I even realized. And it scares the hell out of me because I don't know how to navigate this. I don't know how to be someone's boyfriend when I'm still figuring out who I am and what I want and how to reconcile this part of myself with everything I thought I knew about my life. Timothy brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to Frank's knuckles, his heart overflowing with love and patience and understanding. We'll figure it out together, he said softly, meaning it more than he had ever meant anything, just like we have been doing. One day at a time, one conversation at a time, one moment at a time. Frank smiled then, the expression transforming his entire face and making Timothy fall in love with him all over again. So you'll be patient with me, he asked, his voice hopeful and uncertain, while I figure out how to be your boyfriend, how to be the partner you deserve. Timothy felt like his heart might burst from his chest with the force of his love and relief and joy. I'll be as patient as you need me to be, he said, his voice thick with emotion. We have all the time in the world to figure this out, Frank. There's no rush, no pressure, no timeline we have to follow except our own. Frank leaned in then, capturing Timothy's lips in a kiss that tasted like promises and forever, and the courage to love someone with your whole heart. When they broke apart, Both breathing heavily, Frank rested his forehead against Timothy's, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "I love you," Frank whispered again, like he was testing how the words felt on his tongue, like he was practicing saying them until they felt as natural as breathing. "I love you too," Timothy replied, his voice soft with wonder and gratitude. "I've loved you for 2 years and 4 months, and I'm going to keep loving you for as long as you'll let me, for as long as you want me in your life." The weeks that followed were a study in domestic bliss, punctuated by moments of uncertainty and growth, as Frank continued to navigate his evolving understanding of himself and his sexuality. There were moments of doubt, conversations about the future that left them both feeling vulnerable and exposed, discussions about coming out and what it would mean for Frank's relationships with his family and friends. But there were also moments of pure joy that made all the uncertainty worthwhile. The first time Frank introduced Timothy as his boyfriend to a coworker, his voice proud and certain despite the nervousness in his eyes. The night Timothy fell asleep in Frank's arms and woke up to find Frank watching him with an expression of such tenderness it took his breath away. The lazy Sunday morning they spent in bed, talking and kissing and simply existing in each other's space without any agenda beyond being together. It was Kyle Lee who finally helped Frank work through his remaining doubts about their relationship and his own identity. Frank's older brother had always been the more introspective of the two, thoughtful and wise in ways that Frank had always admired. And when Frank finally worked up the courage to tell him about Timothy, Kyle's response was characteristically thoughtful and supportive. "You know," Kyle said over dinner at his apartment, his voice gentle and understanding, "I always wondered why none of your relationships seemed to make you truly happy. You were always content with the women you dated, but never really joyful, never really yourself in the way that mattered most." Frank pushed his food around his plate nervously, his stomach too knotted with anxiety to properly appreciate Kyle's cooking. "And now," he asked, his voice uncertain, "now you look like someone who's finally figured out what they want," Kyle said with a smile that was warm and genuine and completely free of judgment. "And more importantly, you look like someone who's brave enough to go after it, to reach for the life that will actually make you happy instead of the life you think you're supposed to want." Frank felt tears prick at his eyes, relief and gratitude flooding through him at his brother's acceptance and understanding. "I'm still scared," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm scared that I'm going to mess this up, that I'm not going to be good at being with a man, that I don't know how to be the partner Timothy deserves." Kyle reached across the table and squeezed Frank's hand, his touch warm and reassuring and full of brotherly love. "Being in love is scary no matter who you're in love with," he said gently, his voice filled with the wisdom that comes from his own experiences with love and heartbreak. "But from what you've told me about Timothy, he sounds like someone worth being scared for, someone worth taking the risk for." That night, Frank called Timothy and asked him to come over, his voice urgent with the need to share what had happened with Kyle and to finally put to rest the last of his doubts about their relationship. When Timothy arrived, he found Frank pacing nervously in his living room, his hair mussed from running his hands through it, his energy electric with emotion and determination. "I talked to Kyle today," Frank said without preamble, his words tumbling out in a rush of excitement and relief. "About us, about everything that's been happening between us, about how I've been feeling." Timothy felt his stomach clench with anxiety, hope, and fear warring in his chest. "How did that go?" he asked carefully, prepared for any response. Frank stopped pacing and looked at Timothy with an expression of such love and determination that it took Timothy's breath away completely. "He reminded me that being in love is always scary, but that doesn't mean it's not worth it," Frank said, his voice growing stronger with each word. "He reminded me that I've never been truly happy in any of my previous relationships, and that what I have with you is different, special, worth fighting for." Timothy felt relief flood through him like a tide, washing away weeks of uncertainty and fear. "And," he prompted gently, "and I want to stop being scared," Frank said, moving closer with each word. "I want to stop worrying about what other people think or what this means for my future or whether I'm good enough at this. I want to focus on the fact that I love you and you love me, and that's all that really matters in the end." Timothy felt tears spring to his eyes as Frank reached for his hands, their fingers intertwining with the natural ease that had become second nature to them both. That's all that matters to me, too, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion and relief and overwhelming love. Frank smiled then, the expression bright and genuine and free of the anxiety that had been clouding his features for weeks, like a weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders. I have something for you, he said, releasing Timothy's hands to reach for something on the coffee table, his movements nervous but determined. Timothy watched as Frank picked up a small wrapped box, his heart beginning to race with anticipation and curiosity. Frank, what is this? He asked, his voice breathless with possibility. It's not what you think, Frank said quickly, seeing the expression on Timothy's face and wanting to manage his expectations. I'm not proposing or anything like that. Not yet, anyway. But I wanted to give you something that showed you how serious I am about this, about us, about building a future together. Timothy accepted the box with shaking hands, his fingers trembling as he carefully unwrapped it to reveal a simple silver bracelet with a small engraved charm. He looked closer and saw that the charm bore the coordinates of the coffee shop where Frank had first told him about his breakup with Lisa, where their journey toward each other had really begun in earnest. Frank, Timothy breathed, his voice thick with emotion and wonder. I know it's cheesy, Frank said, his cheeks flushing slightly with embarrassment and hope. But I wanted you to have something that reminded you that this all started with us being honest with each other, with you being brave enough to push me to examine my feelings. And I want us to keep being honest, no matter what challenges we face or how complicated things get. Timothy looked up from the bracelet to find Frank watching him with an expression of nervous hope and overwhelming love. It's perfect, Timothy said, his voice barely above a whisper, his heart so full he thought it might burst. It's absolutely perfect, Frank. I can't believe you thought of this. Frank helped him put the bracelet on, his fingers gentle and sure as they worked the clasp, his touch sending familiar sparks of electricity up Timothy's arm. When it was secure, Timothy held up his wrist to admire it, marveling at how right it felt to wear something that marked him as Frank's, something that symbolized their journey together. I love you, Timothy said, the words feeling both familiar and new on his tongue, carrying the weight of everything they had built together. I love you too, Frank replied, leaning in to kiss him softly, the contact sweet and tender and full of promise. And I'm done being scared about it. I'm ready to be your boyfriend, officially and completely. The months that followed were a testament to the power of love and patience and the willingness to grow together through uncertainty and change. Frank gradually came out to his friends and family, each conversation easier than the last as he grew more comfortable with this new version of himself and more confident in his relationship with Timothy. Timothy was there for all of it, offering support and encouragement and the kind of steady, unconditional love that made even the most difficult conversations feel manageable and worthwhile. They moved in together 6 months after that first kiss, combining their lives with the same careful attention they had brought to combining their hearts. Frank's books found homes next to Timothy's on the shelves, their spines creating a visual representation of their merged interests and dreams. Their coffee mugs mingled in the kitchen cabinet, and their clothes shared space in the closet like they had always belonged together, like this domestic harmony had been inevitable from the very beginning. It was Lenino Sanchez, Frank's best friend from college, who finally put into words what everyone who knew them could see during his visit for the weekend. He was a perceptive man who had known Frank for 15 years, and Timothy had excused himself to take a work call, leaving Frank and Lionel alone in the kitchen to catch up and observe each other. You know, Lionel said, watching through the window as Timothy paced on the balcony, phone pressed to his ear, and gesturing animatedly while he talked. I've known you for 15 years, and I've never seen you this happy, never seen you this settled and content and genuinely yourself. Frank followed his gaze, a soft smile spreading across his face as he watched Timothy work, marveling at how natural it felt to have him in this space, in this life they had built together. I've never been this happy, he admitted, his voice soft with wonder and gratitude. I didn't even know this kind of happiness was possible until I met Timothy. It shows, Lionel said, his voice warm with genuine affection for his friend. You're like a completely different person than you were a year ago. More relaxed, more yourself, more comfortable in your own skin. It's like you finally figured out who you were supposed to be all along. Frank nodded, understanding exactly what Lionel meant and feeling grateful for the friendship that allowed such honest observations. For years, he had felt like he was wearing a costume that didn't quite fit, playing a role that someone else had written for him without ever questioning whether it was the story he actually wanted to tell. But with Timothy, he felt like himself for the first time in his life, authentic and whole and completely accepted. When Timothy came back inside, apologizing for the interruption and the length of the call, Frank pulled him close and pressed a kiss to his temple, marveling at how natural the gesture felt, how right it was to claim this man as his own in front of his oldest friend. "Everything okay?" Timothy asked, leaning into Frank's embrace with the easy comfort of someone who belonged exactly where he was. "Everything's perfect," Frank replied, and meant it more than he had ever meant anything in his life. That night, after Lionel had gone back to his hotel room, Frank and Timothy lay in bed talking about the future in the way that had become their nightly ritual. It was something they did often now, planning trips they wanted to take and goals they wanted to achieve and the life they wanted to build together, their dreams intertwining like their fingers under the covers. "I've been thinking," Frank said, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on Timothy's chest, drawing invisible designs that spoke of love and contentment, "about us, about what comes next in our story together." Timothy's heart skipped a beat, but he kept his voice carefully neutral, not wanting to assume anything or put pressure on Frank to move faster than he was ready. "What about it?" he asked softly. "I know we've only been together for 8 months," Frank said, his voice soft in the darkness of their bedroom. Intimate and honest in the way that nighttime conversations always seem to be. "But I can't imagine my life without you anymore. I don't want to imagine it, and I don't want to spend another day wondering what our future looks like together." Timothy turned in Frank's arms so they were face to face, their foreheads nearly touching in the intimate space they had created under the covers. "I can't imagine mine without you either," he said, his voice soft with love and certainty. "You've become such an integral part of who I am, of how I see my future, that I can't picture any version of my life that doesn't include you." Frank smiled, his hand coming up to cup Timothy's cheek in the gentle gesture that had become second nature to them both. "Good," he said softly, his voice filled with love and determination. "Because I want to spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you make me every single day." Timothy felt tears prick at his eyes as the weight of Frank's words settled between them, heavy with promise and possibility and the kind of love that changes everything. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, afraid to assume too much but unable to stop hope from blooming in his chest. "I'm saying that someday, when the time is right, I want to marry you," Frank said, his voice steady and sure, and filled with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing exactly what you want. "I'm saying that I want to wake up next to you every morning for the rest of my life, that I want to grow old with you and build a family with you and face whatever challenges life throws at us together. I'm saying that you're it for me, Timothy. You're my person, my home, my future." Timothy felt like his heart might burst from his chest as he leaned in to kiss Frank, pouring all of his love and gratitude and hope for the future into the contact. When they broke apart, both breathing heavily, Timothy rested his forehead against Frank's, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "You're my person too," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion and overwhelming love. "You've always been my person, even when I thought I could never have you, even when I was just your friend who loved you from a distance." They made love that night with a tenderness and intensity that left them both breathless and overwhelmed, their bodies moving together like they had been designed for each other, like this physical connection was just another expression of the emotional bond they had built together. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, hearts beating in synchronization, and Timothy marveled at how far they had come from that first conversation in the coffee shop. The next morning, Timothy woke to find Frank already awake, watching him with an expression of such love and contentment that it took his breath away completely. The morning light was streaming through their bedroom window, casting everything in a golden glow that made the moment feel magical and perfect. "Good morning," Frank said softly, pressing a kiss to Timothy's forehead that felt like a blessing and a promise all at once. "Good morning," Timothy replied, stretching like a cat before settling back into Frank's arms, marveling at how right this felt, how natural and perfect their life together had become. What time is it? Early, Frank said, his voice soft and content. But I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about last night, about what we talked about how right it felt to say those things out loud. Timothy felt a flutter of anxiety in his chest, old insecurities rising to the surface despite everything they had built together. Having second thoughts, he asked, trying to keep his voice light. Frank shook his head immediately, his response swift and certain. The opposite, actually. I was thinking about how right it felt to say those things out loud. How right this all feels. How grateful I am that you were brave enough to push me to examine my feelings all those months ago. Timothy smiled, relief flooding through him like a tide, washing away the momentary doubt. It does feel right, doesn't it? He said, his voice soft with wonder and gratitude. Frank nodded, his hand finding Timothy's and intertwining their fingers in the gesture that had become their signature of love and connection. It feels like coming home, he said simply. It feels like everything I've been searching for my whole life without even knowing what I was looking for. They spent the morning in bed, talking and kissing, and simply existing in each other's space. And Timothy found himself thinking about how much had changed since that day in the coffee shop, when Frank had walked in looking like his world had fallen apart. Now, lying in Frank's arms with the morning light streaming through their bedroom window, Timothy felt like his world had finally fallen into place in the most beautiful way possible. It was a year later, on the anniversary of their first kiss, that Frank finally proposed. He had planned an elaborate evening, dinner at the restaurant where they had their first official date, followed by a walk through the park where they had shared so many conversations about their future and their dreams and their love for each other. But in the end, the proposal happened in their kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday morning while they were making coffee and discussing their plans for the day, because that's where their love lived, in the ordinary moments that made up a life together. Timothy was reaching for his favorite mug when Frank Aroem suddenly dropped to one knee behind him, a small velvet box in his hand and his heart pounding with love and nervous excitement. Timothy turned around and nearly dropped the mug when he saw Frank kneeling there, his eyes bright with love and nervous excitement and the kind of determination that comes from knowing exactly what you want from life. Frank, Timothy breathed, his heart racing as he took in the sight of the man he loved more than anything in the world, kneeling in their kitchen with a ring box in his hand. I know this isn't the romantic proposal I had planned, Frank said, his voice slightly shaky but filled with love and certainty. I had this whole elaborate evening mapped out, dinner and a walk through the park and all the romantic gestures I thought you deserved. But I woke up this morning and watched you brush your teeth and make coffee and read the news on your phone, and I realized that I don't want to spend another day without knowing that you're going to be my husband. Timothy felt tears spring to his eyes as Frank opened the box to reveal a simple platinum band that somehow managed to be exactly what Timothy would have chosen for himself, elegant and understated and perfect in its simplicity. Timothy Rivera, Frank continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, filled with all the love and certainty that had been building in his heart for months. Will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life loving you and making you coffee and listening to you complain about your coworkers and growing old with you and building a family with you and facing whatever challenges life throws at us together? Timothy was crying openly now, his hands shaking as he reached down to cup Frank's face, his heart so full of love and joy and gratitude that he thought it might actually burst from his chest. Yes, he said, his voice thick with emotion and overwhelming happiness. Yes, of course. Yes, 1,000 times yes. Frank's face broke into a grin that was brighter than the morning sun as he slipped the ring onto Timothy's finger, the metal warm and solid and perfect against his skin, a physical symbol of everything they had built together and everything they planned to build in the future. Then he was standing and pulling Timothy into his arms, spinning him around their kitchen while they both laughed and cried and held each other like they never wanted to let go. When Frank finally set him down, they were both breathless and grinning like idiots. And Timothy couldn't stop staring at the ring on his finger, marveling at how right it felt, how perfect and natural and meant to be. I love you, Timothy said, the words feeling both familiar and completely new in the context of their engagement, carrying the weight of their entire journey together. I love you too, Frank replied, leaning in to kiss him softly, the contact sweet and tender and full of promise for their future together. My fiancé. The word sent a thrill through Timothy's entire body, making him laugh with pure joy and overwhelming happiness. Your fiancé, he repeated, testing how the word felt on his tongue. I like the sound of that more than I can possibly express. They were married 6 months later in a small ceremony in Kyle's backyard, surrounded by the friends and family who had supported them through their journey to each other and who had watched their love grow and flourish. Timothy wore a navy suit that brought out his eyes and made Frank's breath catch in his throat. And Frank wore gray with a tie that matched Timothy's suit perfectly, a small detail that spoke to how in sync they had become. Eugene served as Timothy's best man, beaming with pride and joy as he watched his friend marry the man he had loved for so long. Kyle stood up for Frank, his eyes bright with tears of happiness, as he watched his brother finally find the love and authenticity he had been searching for his entire life. When the officiant pronounced them married and told them they could kiss, Frank cupped Timothy's face in his hands and looked into his eyes with an expression of such love and gratitude that Timothy felt his knees go weak with the force of it. I love you, Mr. Murphy, Frank whispered, using Timothy's new name for the first time and making Timothy's heart skip several beats with joy. I love you too, Mr. Murphy, Timothy replied, his voice thick with emotion and overwhelming happiness. And then Frank was kissing him, and the small crowd was cheering, and Timothy felt like the luckiest person in the entire world. The reception was held in the same backyard, with string lights and wildflowers, and a playlist of all their favorite songs creating the perfect atmosphere for celebrating their love. Timothy and Frank's first dance was to the song that had been playing in the coffee shop the day they had their first real conversation about feelings. And as they swayed together under the stars, Timothy marveled at how perfectly everything had worked out, how all the pain and uncertainty had led them to this moment of pure joy. Later that night, as they lay in bed in the hotel room, where they would spend their wedding night before flying to Italy for their honeymoon, Timothy traced patterns on Frank's chest and thought about the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect happiness. Do you ever think about what would have happened if Lisa hadn't broken up with you? Timothy asked softly, his voice thoughtful in the darkness. Frank considered the question seriously, his hands stroking Timothy's hair in the gentle rhythm that had become second nature to him. I think we would have found our way to each other eventually, he said finally, his voice filled with certainty and love. Maybe it would have taken longer, maybe it would have been messier and more complicated, but I think we were always meant to be together. I think our souls recognized each other from the very beginning. Timothy smiled, pressing a kiss to Frank's collarbone and marveling at how perfectly they fit together. I think so too, he said softly. I think we were always heading toward this moment, even when we didn't know it. Frank tightened his arms around Timothy, pulling him closer and pressing a kiss to the top of his head. I'm glad it happened the way it did, though, he said, his voice soft with gratitude and love. I'm glad we got to be friends first. That we built this foundation of trust and understanding and genuine affection before we added romance to it. It makes everything we have now feel so much stronger and more real. Timothy nodded, understanding exactly what Frank meant and feeling grateful for the same thing. Their friendship had been the bedrock that their relationship was built on, and it remained the foundation even now that they were married, making their love feel unshakable and permanent in the most beautiful way. They spent their honeymoon exploring the Italian countryside, visiting small towns that seemed frozen in time, and eating incredible food that tasted like sunshine and possibility. They made love in hotel rooms with windows that opened onto ancient streets, and they sat on balconies in the evening light, talking about everything and nothing while sipping wine that tasted like dreams come true. But Timothy's favorite moments were the quiet ones, when they would sit together in comfortable silence, watching the world go by and marveling at the fact that they were married, that they have found each other and chosen each other and built this beautiful life together. On their last night in Italy, they sat on the terrace of their hotel in Tuscany, watching the sun set over the rolling hills and sipping wine that tasted like sunshine and possibility and the promise of forever. The air was warm and sweet with the scent of jasmine, and Timothy felt like he was living in a dream that was better than anything he had ever dared to imagine. I can't believe we're married, Timothy said, still marveling at the ring on his finger and the matching one on Frank's, still amazed by the reality of their love and commitment. Frank smiled, bringing Timothy's hand to his lips and pressing a soft kiss to his ring finger. The gesture tender and reverent and full of love. "Best decision I ever made," he said simply, his voice filled with certainty and gratitude and overwhelming happiness. Timothy felt his heart swell with love as he looked at his husband, this man who had been brave enough to question everything he thought he knew about himself, who had been willing to risk their friendship for the chance at something more, who had chosen to love him with his whole heart despite the uncertainty and fear. "I love you, Frank Murphy," Timothy said, the words feeling both familiar and new on his tongue, carrying the weight of everything they had been through together and everything they planned to face in the future. "I love you too, Timothy Murphy," Frank replied, and leaned in to kiss him as the sun disappeared behind the hills and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, marking the end of their honeymoon and the beginning of their married life together. They returned from their honeymoon to their apartment in the city, to Jim and friends and the ordinary magic of married life that was somehow more beautiful than any vacation could ever be. Timothy kept Frank's coffee mug next to his in the cabinet, and Frank kept Timothy's favorite books on the nightstand next to his side of the bed, and they built a life together that was filled with small moments of joy and connection and the steady, reliable love of two people who had found their home in each other. They fought occasionally about whose turn it was to do the dishes and whether they could afford to go out to dinner twice in one week, and Timothy's tendency to leave his socks on the bedroom floor. But they always made up quickly, their arguments never lasting long enough to do any real damage to the foundation they had built together. Because they had learned that love was not about never fighting, but about fighting fair and always choosing each other in the end. It was Eugene who pointed out, 6 months after the wedding, that Timothy had never looked happier or more settled, that marriage had transformed him in ways that were visible to anyone who cared to look. "Marriage suits you," Eugene said over lunch at their favorite restaurant, his voice warm with affection and genuine happiness for his friend. "You look like someone who's finally figured out where he belongs in the world, like you've found your place and your person and your purpose all at once." Timothy smiled, thinking about Frank at home, probably grading papers at their kitchen table while he waited for Timothy to get back from lunch, probably humming to himself the way he always did when he was content. "I have figured out where I belong," he said, his voice soft with certainty and love. "I belong with Frank, building this life we've created together." Eugene raised his glass in a toast, his eyes bright with tears of happiness for his friend. "To finding your person," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "To finding my person," Timothy agreed, clinking his glass against Eugene's and marveling at how far he had come from the lonely, hopeful man who had loved Frank from a distance for so long. That night, Timothy came home to find Frank exactly where he had imagined him, sitting at their kitchen table with a stack of papers and a red pen, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose, in the way that never failed to make Timothy's heart skip a beat with love and affection. "Hey," Frank said, looking up with a smile when Timothy walked in, his face lighting up in the way that still made Timothy feel like the most important person in the world. "How was lunch with Eugene?" "Good," Timothy said, dropping a kiss on the top of Frank's head before settling into the chair next to him, breathing in the familiar scent of Frank's shampoo and feeling his heart settle with the contentment that came from being home. "He says marriage suits me." Frank reached over and took Timothy's hand, his thumb tracing over the wedding ring that Timothy still marveled at wearing every single day. "It suits you," he agreed, his voice soft with love and certainty. "It suits us perfectly." Timothy looked around their kitchen, at the photos on the refrigerator and the coffee maker that Frank had programmed to start automatically every morning, and the dish towels that Timothy had bought because they matched the curtains, and felt a deep sense of contentment settle over him like a warm blanket. This was the life he had dreamed of during those 2 years and 4 months of loving Frank from a distance, this ordinary, extraordinary life filled with small moments of joy and connection, and the steady, reliable love of the person who knew him better than anyone else in the world. "Yeah," Timothy said, squeezing Frank's hand and marveling at how perfectly their fingers fit together. "It definitely suits us." And as Frank went back to grading papers and Timothy started dinner, humming softly to himself as he moved around their kitchen, he thought about how sometimes the most beautiful love stories are the ones that catch you completely off guard, the ones that start with friendship and grow into something deeper and more lasting than anything you could have imagined. Sometimes the most frightening dares, like telling your best friend you're in love with him, lead to the most beautiful discoveries about yourself and the person you're meant to be. Sometimes the person you've been looking for has been right there all along, waiting for you to be brave enough to see what was always meant to be. Then we're both exactly where we need to be, Timothy thought, watching Frank work with the late afternoon light streaming through their kitchen window, and knew with absolute certainty that he was home, that this was where his story was always meant to lead, that every moment of pain and uncertainty and hope had been worth it to arrive at this perfect, ordinary, extraordinary life with the man he loved more than anything in the world.